Continuing in Descartes' Discourse on Method using the Hackett edition, let's wrap up part 2 and possibly begin part 3 of the Discourse on Method. So he's just been describing his rules for getting rid of false opinions and hopefully adding true ones, adding as many true ones as possible, but starting by getting rid of all the false ones that he possibly can get rid of. So those rules were described 2 videos back in this series, and you can read them in part 2 of the discourse for yourself. And he's just been talking about geometry and algebra. He's been talking about math stuff. Why has he been talking about math? Not primarily because math is a great source of important truths, although there are a few truths you can get from math, but because math, or more specifically geometry and algebra, these are good ways of thinking. And it's not that you can apply geometry outside of geometry to find a bunch of knowledge that was not there because it's not there, it's not in geometry. Geometry can't extend to philosophy. It's that the way of seeking truth in geometry is so good that if we can learn to practice it, or practice a similar way of seeking truth in other areas, then we'll avoid a whole lot more error than we do, and hopefully gain more truth as well. Those are not the same thing, by the way. That's something William James talks about, but I don't want to introduce a William James style critique of the Discourse on Method right now. I should try to put that out of my head as much as I can. While I'm trying to talk about Descartes, I want to talk about Descartes, not William James right now. Okay, so he's been talking about his method. Now, the method of doubt, the famous method, is something he'll describe in part 4. I think it's safe to say that the method of doubt is the big one, and that's what he's working up to. And what he's talking about now is a precursor to the method of doubt, an early version of the method of doubt. But he is describing it as a method, and it's not unreasonable to say it's a related method. One connects to the other, one builds on the other, or something like that, but they're distinct methods. There's the method of part 2 of the discourse, and there's the famous or infamous method of doubt from part 4 of the discourse. You can distinguish and separate them that way if you like. I prefer to think one is an early version of the other. Anyway, the method he's been describing in part 4 of the discourse, part 2 of the discourse, where we are still in the text, is modeled after geometry. But what pleased me most about this method was that by means of it I was assured of using my reason in everything, if not perfectly, at least as well as was in my power. And in addition, I felt that in practicing this method, my mind was little by little getting into the habit of conceiving its objects more rigorously and more distinctly, and that, not having restricted the method to any particular subject matter, I promised myself to apply it as usefully to the problems of the other sciences as I had to those of algebra. Now, that's part of why I'm inclined to think that the method of doubt in part 4 really is the same method in part 2. It's just applied more fully. And that's probably the best way of phrasing it. It's not that it's building on the earlier method or fully developing the earlier method. It's that it's applying the method more fully. So I think it is best to say that the method of part 2 is the same thing as the method of doubt in part 4. It's just that when he gets to the method of doubt in part 4, he's applying the method of part 2 more thoroughly. And you could read parts 2, 3, and 4 of the discourse as saying, Descartes says, here's the method modeled after geometry for seeking truth with the kind of precision and reliability you can expect from geometry, but learning how to apply that kind of precision and reliability to everything outside of geometry, to philosophy, to religion, to science, to ethics. And part 3 covers how he did this for 9 years, never did it systematically because he never applied it to the foundations of philosophy. And then in part 4, he finally gets a chance to apply it more systematically by going down to the very foundations of philosophical knowledge, which is the foundation of basically all knowledge. All right. So, I need to get back to the passage I just read. In practicing this method, my mind was little by little getting into the habit of conceiving its objects more rigorously and more distinctly. Not restricting the method to any particular subject matter, I promised to apply it as usefully to the problems of the other sciences as I had to those of algebra. So he's practicing a method described with his 4 rules, 2 videos back, and read it for yourself in part 2 of the discourse. He's describing the method modeled after math that he described for getting rid of false opinions and finding true ones. And here he says these 2 or 3 points I want to emphasize, and then I'll try to shut up and move on. First point, even more important than any particular error this method removes or truth this method reveals, is the fact that it trains the mind to think carefully. Training the mind to think carefully is of the utmost importance. Next point. Although I think at this point I'm repeating myself, this needs to be repeated. This is super important Descartes stuff. His goal is to apply this method, modeled after mathematical precision and accuracy, to areas outside of math, to ultimately philosophy, and then everything else that comes from philosophy, including science. I felt that in practicing this method, etc., etc., I promised myself, blah, blah. Yes, one more thing. Third point, and then maybe I can shut up about this passage and move on to the next one. He was getting into the habit of, his mind was getting into the habit of conceiving its objects more rigorously and more distinctly. So the things we're thinking about must be conceived rigorously and distinctly. So Descartes is all about training the mind, as I've said. That was my point 2 points back. But on this point, I want to elaborate on that point by saying, this third point, that the point of training your mind, using this method modeled after math, is above all to train your mind to think about the things it's thinking about clearly and distinctly. The object of your thought must be conceived in your mind with maximum clarity, maximum distinctness. That is the way to gain knowledge. Now let's wrap up part 2 and then give up on getting to part 3 in this video. But having noted that the principles of these sciences, namely all the other areas of study, all the other fields of knowledge, having noted that the principles of all these other fields of knowledge must be derived from philosophy, in which I did not yet find any that were certain, I thought it was necessary for me first of all to try to establish some there, and that this being the most important thing in the world, and the thing in which hasty judgment and prejudice were most to be feared, I should not try to accomplish that objective until I had reached a more mature age than that of merely 23. So he's only 23 years old, sitting in the stove-heated room. And he says that he needs to spend a great deal of time preparing myself for it, as much in rooting out from my mind all the wrong opinions that I'd accepted before that time, as in accumulating many experiences, etc. So the point is much more on getting rid of false opinions than on gaining true ones at this point. All right, we'll quit there. Now, let me see how I can paraphrase or comment on whatever I just read. So the principles, he wants to apply his method for gaining knowledge and getting rid of false opinions to everything. It's modeled after the precision and accuracy, reliability of math, but it needs to be applied to everything, to all the fields of study, like what we now call science, all the areas of science, and to philosophy, and to ethics. But all of these things have their foundation in the principles of philosophy, so he's got to apply it to philosophy. But he's not ready to do that yet. He will not be ready to do that until he spends 9 years doing this other stuff and applying this method and getting rid of as many false opinions as possible to everywhere else. And then he's going to go to the foundation of it all and apply this method to philosophy, and that's what's going to happen with the famous method of doubt in part 4. So, end of this video. Next video, I expect we can finally begin part 3 of the Discourse on Method, and it's going to be awesome because it's Descartes and it's awesome. Thanks for watching.